They were never supposed to find the bones. 143 unmarked graves hidden beneath the rotting floorboards of an abandoned church in the woods of upstate New York, each skeleton twisted in a pose of agony, limbs shattered yet healed, drowned lungs but no water nearby, strange symbols carved into their bones, not with blades, but burned in. Who buried them? And more importantly, why? Pause. A slow breath. The whisper deepens into something cold and commanding. You've been lied to about what this country was built on. You've been taught to trust churches, laws, leaders. But what if I told you that the rot began not in the shadows but behind the pulpit? That a family, forgotten by most, manipulated an entire town into ritual suffering under the illusion of salvation? And that their legacy is not dead. It was never dead. Sound fades into the forest wind, leaves rustle, a crow caws. They called themselves the Ravencrofts, 3 brothers, charismatic, brilliant, and monstrous. In 1825, they arrived in the town of Ravenwood, posing as prophets. But they weren't spreading faith, they were spreading control, mind-breaking, soul-shattering control. You are about to hear the secrets the government locked away for over 160 years. Documents I wasn't supposed to find, rituals that twisted the minds of hundreds, pain worship disguised as purity. Screen glitches faintly, almost like surveillance interference. Voice hardens. This isn't just a history lesson. This is a doorway, and the moment you walk through it, you don't come back the same, because once you see how deep the lie goes, how power feeds on faith, on pain, on obedience, you change. You either wake up or you kneel. There's no third option. A beat of silence. So I ask you now, are you ready to descend into the truth, to tear the veil and see what was hidden behind the stained glass? You have 8 seconds to turn away. After that, you're mine. Screen fades to black, except for one word etched in red across wood grain. Ravencroft. The Ravencroft brothers didn't come from nowhere. They emerged from something older, something seeded far deeper than the public was ever allowed to trace. Official records list their place of birth as Salem, Massachusetts, but those who looked closer found discrepancies. Census logs vanish, family ties disintegrate under scrutiny, and one name keeps appearing in whispered correspondence between early colonial ministers and secret medical societies. House of Witherhall, a private estate now erased from all modern maps, where infants were raised in silence, subjected to something called the doctrine of hollowing. Ezra, the eldest, Deacon Silas, the scholar, and Prophet Caleb, the voice. 3 minds, 1 doctrine. They didn't believe in saving souls. They believed in emptying them, hollowing out the self until nothing remained but obedience. Pain was not the enemy, pain was the purifier. And the people of Ravenwood, they were chosen. They arrived under the guise of charity. They built shelters, brought medicine, preached sermons about second chances and divine cleansing. But it was never about God. It was about ownership. Each sermon laced with hypnotic cadence, each prayer a subtle test of loyalty. By the winter of 1826, the brothers had converted over 200 villagers, not through miracles, but through psychological collapse. They broke the people, then rebuilt them in their image. It began with something called the severing, a ritual designed to extract memory, identity, will. Children were taken from parents, wives from husbands, families dissolved, not killed, not yet, just disassembled, broken like clay dolls and remolded to serve, and the town, in its isolated, God-fearing delirium, allowed it. No one left. No one ran. Because by then, they didn't remember why they ever would. And here's the part that burns itself into your bones. The brothers kept no journals, no ledgers, no holy books. Their doctrine was passed through speech only, through chanting, through pain, through obedience, meaning even now, even as you hear this, the language of their control still echoes, still waits to be spoken again, still buried in someone's bloodline. You want to know what really happened beneath that church? Why the bones scream without sound? Why the federal agents who entered Ravenwood in 1862 never came back the same? We'll get there. But first you must understand, this wasn't a cult. It was a prototype. By the spring of 1827, Ravenwood no longer resembled a town. The markets fell silent. Windows were covered in black cloth. No letters left the village. No carts returned from trade. Outsiders who passed through described a strange, oppressive stillness, as if time itself held its breath around the borders of that place. No laughter, no crying, just a collective hum, low and rhythmic, like distant chanting from the earth itself. The Ravencroft brothers had restructured society. Days were divided not by hours, but by ritual cycles. Each person wore linen robes dyed in ash and iron, marked with symbols that designated their stage of purification. There were no names anymore, only ranks, initiates, bleeders, voices, vessels, and above them all, the three: Ezra, Silas, Caleb, or as the villagers now called them, Flame, Mind, and Mouth. And no one disobeyed. Not because of threats, but because disobedience had been removed from them, stripped out like a splinter from flesh. It wasn't religion, it was reprogramming. The brothers understood something far darker than scripture. They knew the architecture of control, how to dismantle the psyche with silence, how to rewire a mind using only pain, isolation, and repetition. Silas had studied early surgical techniques, not to heal the body, but to unmake the soul. Autopsies weren't performed on the dead, but on the living. To watch how trauma bloomed across the nervous system. They kept no written sermons. Their scripture was the scar. You want proof? Listen carefully. Every bone found beneath that church had the same carvings, not symbols of worship, but sequences, patterns, repeated angles and spirals that modern neurologists now recognize as crude depictions of the brain's anatomy. The Ravencrofts weren't killing people for faith, they were experimenting with obedience, trying to build something, refine something, and they came horrifyingly close. The final stage was known only as the hollowing. Survivors, if they can even be called that, were kept in subterranean rooms for 33 days. No light, no sound but their own breath, fed only rainwater and honey. Every hour the phrase, "You are not," was whispered into the chamber, over and over, until the mind collapsed inward. What emerged was no longer human. It obeyed, it served, it smiled when ordered to bleed. And according to records buried deep in federal vaults, one of those things may have escaped. Shall I take you deeper? The hollowed ones, that's what the surviving documents called them. Not people, not victims, products, failures and successes measured in obedience and silence. Federal testimony from 1903 describes a single survivor found wandering 40 miles south of Ravenwood, barefoot, emaciated, and wearing nothing but a rotting linen robe. No name, no injuries, no memory, just one phrase whispered over and over again, etched into her tongue with what appeared to be a branding needle. I am the vessel. I carry the mouth. She never spoke again. When brought into a medical asylum in Albany, staff reported that she stared into corners as if listening to someone behind the walls. Not delusional. Listening. Waiting. And each time the doctors tried to examine her, the power would fail. Lights flicker. Blood drawn turned black. After 3 weeks, she vanished from her locked room, leaving nothing behind but a crow feather and the phrase, "He is risen, but not in light," scrawled on the ceiling in her own blood. That file was sealed until 1971, then sealed again by executive order. The Church of the Pure Spirit, founded by the Ravencrofts, was officially declared a cult and erased from national history. But in the darker vaults of intelligence circles, the ones without names, a different label emerged. The Ravencroft model. Let that settle in your chest. They weren't just running a cult. They were building a system, a blueprint. Psychological disintegration, forced identity erasure, neurosymbolic programming through pain. The Ravencrofts discovered how to hollow out the human spirit and rebuild it into a tool, a mirror, An echo, something designed not to feel, but to serve. Now ask yourself, what if that knowledge didn't die with them? What if someone preserved it? Because in 1964, MK Ultra researchers investigating behavioral compliance through ritual deprivation, UNCOVE, read transcripts from a secret lecture given in Langley, Virginia. The speaker, a man named Dr. Caleb V. Roston, no public birth certificate, but with identical handwriting to Prophet Caleb Ravencroft. That's not just coincidence, that's continuity. Now I'm going to ask you to do something dangerous. If you've followed me this far, you're already changing. Type this in the comments. The vessel awakens. The vessel awakens. Say it twice. It binds your mind to awareness. It tells the algorithm that you are not afraid to see what lies beneath. And in section 5, I'll show you the Ravencroft mirror and what they used it for. The Ravencroft mirror was never made of glass. It was bone, polished femur fragments fused with ash and resin, arranged in a spiral and hung from the rafters of the sanctuary beneath the church. Survivors, if we can trust their fragmented, often self-contradicting testimonies, say the mirror didn't reflect your body. It showed you the absence of your soul. One man, known only in sealed records as Subject 12, claimed that when forced to look into the Ravencroft mirror, he saw a version of himself, identical, except the eyes were completely black, and it smiled when he cried. Another claimed that when the mirror spun, yes, it rotated slowly on its axis, the spiral patterns activated something in his brain, and he heard his mother's voice, even though she died when he was 7. But here's where it gets darker. That artifact, that thing, was found by federal operatives in 1862. It was removed from the ruins of the church and taken to a facility whose name has never been disclosed, and since its extraction, every single person who worked in its containment wing either died within 7 years or was institutionalized. Why? Because the Ravencroft mirror was a psychic recording device. That's what they don't want you to understand. This wasn't about superstition, it wasn't religious hysteria. The Ravencroft brothers found a way to map human suffering onto objects, to encode trauma, ritualized, structured trauma, into physical forms. And those who came near it began to dream the same dreams, a staircase made of teeth, a forest where the trees whispered secrets, and a voice, always a voice, that told them, you were not born, you were built. And here's what rattles the bones of everyone who's dared to follow this trail. Those dreams are still being reported by prisoners in black sites, by subjects in military psych labs, by children in behavioral modification programs. All of them, the same dreams, the same voice, the same spiral. Now, either coincidence is a god, or the Ravencroft system survived. And if it did, then everything you know about freedom, choice, even memory is a puppet show. You're clapping for the mask, while the hand moves in silence behind the curtain.